What are we discussing on today's Locked On Diamondbacks podcast? Did the D-backs just have their best victory of the season? And we got some last-minute trade deadline targets for you guys as the deadline is only a few hours away.
You are Locked On Diamondbacks, your daily Arizona Diamondbacks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. You're listening to who? The always charismatic host of this podcast, Millard Thomas. I'm a multimedia journalist and I'm a graphic designer, so please go check out my website, millardthomas24.myportfolio.com. On there you can see all my latest work, from my packages to my articles to my photos and my graphic design. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnMLB and use code all lowercase LockedOnMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. Last night, the D-backs might have had their greatest victory of the season, and we'll be discussing it on today's Locked On Diamondbacks podcast, along with some last-minute trade deadline targets as the deadline is quickly approaching and only a few hours away. Thank you for making Locked On Diamondbacks your first listen every day. I would not be able to do this podcast without you, my loyal listeners, sharing, subscribing, reviewing, doing all that so I could do this podcast for you. Thank you. It's free. It's available on all platforms, so please continue to tell your friends. And one of those platforms is YouTube. Please hit subscribe to Locked On Diamondbacks on YouTube. All right, now let's get into the podcast and let's discuss last night's win, because last night was arguably the greatest Answerbacks victory all season. We've talked about this team since June 29th. The resilience, the clutchness, the offense overall has really been the thing that has stood out from this team since that date that we always like to bring up, which now, today being July 30th, is now a month sample size where since June 29th, this D-backs team number one in runs scored in the National League. They are tied for second in home runs during that time as well. And so from an overall offensive perspective, this team is looking great. WRC plus, they're also number one. They're number one in WAR, like across the board. This team is playing great offensively since June 29th. Now, pitching wise, is it as good as the offense? No, but from a pitching perspective, 6th in the ERA during that time. So a lot better from a pitching perspective as well. Maybe not last night was the best example, because last night when you watch the game, the reason it was such a good victory and such a good exemplification of how this D-backs team has been playing since June 29th is because of the resilience, the never back down attitude that this D-backs team has shown and continues to show throughout this season. You go down 6 runs early, courtesy of Jordan Montgomery, who we'll talk about later in this segment, because Monty's a major swing piece for this D-backs team and just not playing good baseball right now. I thought this was going to be a start where potentially Jordan Montgomery builds momentum off what he did last week. He was not, I wouldn't say elite last week, but he was definitely fine. He looked good for his first start back off the injured list. I thought he was fine. 5 innings. His most recent start, 1 earned run. Like, I didn't think it was the best start of all time. I didn't think he was dominating opposing hitters last week, but I thought it was a start. First time back off the injured list, post All-Star break, something to build off of, especially going against an opponent in the Washington Nationals, who are clearly trade deadline sellers, not trying to improve at this current moment, trying to probably lose as many games as possible in the second half of the season with this young core, get another top pick, and just keep adding to what you already have. I would not be upset at all if that was the Washington Nationals' current philosophy. And for Jordan Montgomery, it was going to be a perfect opportunity to continue to build yourself back up, continue to get better in shape, and potentially deliver some big wins as we enter the second half of the season, the stretch run of the year when you need to play your absolute best baseball. I thought Jordan Montgomery was potentially going to step up. I thought maybe he was a big game player, and last night didn't show it. 5 runs in the first, another run in the second, and the D-backs all of a sudden are now down 6 runs as a team that's known for punching their opponent in the mouth first. It was the Dbacks who were punched in the mouth, the nose, the eye, the ear. They were beat up by the time they left the second inning. But even being down 6 runs, I did have a little Delulu feeling yesterday, a little inkling like, I don't know. I kind of think the D-backs could come back in this game. Now, I didn't tweet it out. I didn't think it was going to be entirely possible because as soon as Miguel Castro comes in the fifth, you're like, oh, the D-backs are conceding this game. I've seen this game before. There's a bunch of games throughout the season this year where you could go look at the box score and say, oh, D-backs were down 5 runs, 6 runs after 3. I can see why Scott McGuff and Miguel Castro both pitched on the same day. There's a lot of games where the D-backs go down a lot of runs early, and Torey Lovullo puts in the worst relievers out the bullpen, which I really respect. Those are the days where the Logan Allens and the Brandon Hughes and the Castros and the Scott McGuffs pitch. Those are also the games where you kind of concede as well, unless the D-backs have a crazy performance like they did last night, because you go down 6 runs early. Like I said, I felt like the D-backs could come back. They started chipping away. They had some moments before that 9th inning comeback of showing signs of life, showing signs that they could chip away and potentially come back. But again, Miguel Castro comes in, you go down 6-2, Castro comes in, gives up a couple more runs, and now you're down 6 runs again. That's why it felt a little delulu to think that they could come back in the game, because I was like, yeah, if it's only a 6-run deficit, the D-backs to come back. But if you're going to have guys like Miguel Castro, every time you chip away, they give up more runs to the opposing team. Felt like the D-backs were going to have to do so much heavy lifting if they really want to come back in last night's game. And that's what they were able to do. They just kept chipping away, and they didn't let some of the struggles of their pitching slow them down. They actually picked up their pitchers and carried them to victory. Scored a run in the 7th, scored a run in the 8th. And then once you got to the 9th inning, I still don't know how believable a comeback was going to be, because going down 4 runs entering the 9th is still a lot of work to do. And Alek Thomas starts it off with a triple. Vibes are up. You're like, okay, we might have a chance here. And then if you're a Nationals fan, this is where it gets frustrating if you did want them to win last night. Like if you're betting on the Nationals last night, this is where it gets frustrating, because you're up 6 after 2. You're up 8-2 after 6. You're entering the 9th up 4. And then, okay, you give up the Alek Thomas triple. You still have a 4-run lead. But then Domo, 2 strikes. He comes through with an RBI single. Ketel Marte, 2 strikes. He comes through with a 2-run home run. Gurriel, 2 strikes. He comes through with a single. And then, of course, Corbin Carroll, the guy who has been struggling all year for the D-backs. We know he's the D-backs' best player, but he has been struggling mightily this year. But when he strutted up to the plate as a pinch hitter last night, I was like, the D-backs are going to win this game. The way that the D-backs had momentum, scoring 3 runs before even recording an out, it felt like the D-backs were going to win that game once Corbin Carroll came up to the plate. And that's what he did. He smacked a hanging splitter into the right field seats. First walk-off home run of his career, capped off probably the greatest Answerback victory of the season, because at every single moment they showed their resilience, whether it was down 6 runs early after the second, down 8-2, down 8-4 entering the 9th, or even the fact that the D-backs were down multiple runs entering the 10th inning yesterday against the Pittsburgh Pirates, or the day before yesterday, and almost but couldn't complete the victory. The fact that they didn't let that failure and disappointment in the finale against the Pirates hold them back in game number 1. The fact that they weren't like, oh my God, we were here already before, we're going to make the same mistakes and lose this game again. No, they learned from their mistakes and were able to complete the victory against the Washington Nationals. And now you could say it was arguably their best answer-back victory all season long. Now, going forward, we have some major question marks about Jordan Montgomery and his future status with his D-backs team and being in the rotation, because we just got a report last couple of days that the D-backs rotation might be getting healthier sooner than we thought. They're saying Erod and Kelly could be doing rehab, simulated games over the next week. They think Erod could be back by early August. Kelly potentially not too far behind him. And with Gallen locked in, Font locked in, if Erod and Kelly could come back and immediately look better than Jordan Montgomery, those are my top 4 starters for a postseason rotation, with Montgomery outside looking in. And to be honest, for the rest of the regular season, like, yes, Monty would probably be in the rotation, but if we're being honest with ourselves, If Kelly and Erod come back and they're better than Monty, Gallon Fott, I know are better than Monty. I think it should be a real conversation between Ryan Nelson and Jordan Montgomery of who should be the D-backs number 5 starter for the rest of the season, because that's how good Ryan Nelson has been recently. That's how bad Jordan Montgomery has been this year. So it's a real conversation now of whether or not Jordan Montgomery should even be the number 5 starter for the D-backs going forward. But I think we all have to see it play out with the health of the Kelly and the Erods, the quality of play that they have when they come back. Like, I think all that factors in, but we're still a little ways before we have to get into that. So Jordan Montgomery should still have a couple more starts to see if he can turn his season around before we have to make any really hard and tough decisions. But you never know. As we said, today is a trade deadline day. So maybe the D-backs are looking at some last minute targets to upgrade this team and potentially upgrade their rotation. And we'll talk about some last minute targets in segment number 2. But hey, if you're looking to play America's #1 daily fantasy sports app, then you're looking to play Prize Picks, because with over 5 million active members, it is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Like other apps on Prize Picks, it's just you against the numbers. All you do is pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stats projections and watch the winnings roll in. Get in on the daily action with your friends and become part of the Prize Picks community today. You can now win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000. Prize Picks is available in more than 30 states across the country, including California, Texas, and Georgia. Download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. That's code LOCKEDONMLB on Prize Picks for a deposit match up to $100. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. Now let's get into the podcast. Let's get back into the podcast and discuss if the D-backs need to go out there and look at some last minute trade deadline targets. I got some targets to discuss. And again, I want to do it like dream versus realistic, like we did it on yesterday's podcast, because I thought that was a really fun exercise. And for the D-backs on yesterday's podcast, we talked about starting pitchers, and maybe you guys should go back and listen to that podcast, because the way that Jordan Montgomery is pitching right now, I would not be surprised if the D-backs want to sniff around that starting pitching market a little bit. We said the dream yesterday was either Tariq Skubal or Garrett Crochet. Those guys would be massive dreams for this D-backs rotation. One of the realistic options was a Kikuchi, who was traded yesterday to the Houston Astros, so he's out as a candidate, but the D-backs could still sniff around the market with the questionable health of the rotation and the poor play of Jordan Montgomery, and even the questionable play of guys like Zach Allen. I could see the D-backs sniffing around the market. But there are still some other areas on this D-backs team that the D-backs should think about upgrading. I think the one area to me that sticks out the most, the D-backs already addressed their left-handed bullpen depth by going out there and getting AJ Puck. Now it's not just Joe Mansupply. To me, the biggest weakness on this D-backs team right now, and I'm actually very upset that the D-backs did this transaction recently, but that last spot in the bullpen right now, man, that Miguel Castro spot where it's just a nothing, where Miguel Castro just not a good reliever. Every time he goes out there, it feels like he's giving up earned runs. It feels like the opposing team is just doing batting practice when he's in the game. He is horrendous. He is one of the worst pitchers I've ever seen, and he has not been effective for 2 years now with the D-backs. I don't understand why it's taken so long for him to get off the roster. And 3 of his last 4 appearances, he's given up multi-earned run games. Why is Miguel Castro still pitching? He is the biggest weakness on this D-backs team. Every other player, I can at least make an argument that they're helping out the D-backs in some way. Even if you're struggling, at least a guy like Corbin Carroll still has speed, and we saw clutchness last night. Alec Thomas still has elite defense in the glove. Eugenio Suarez is starting to turn his season around, so you can at least talk positively about him. Like every person on this D-backs roster, I can at least make an argument that they have some aspect to be a positive contributor to this D-backs team. Miguel Castro has nothing, and I was actually upset that the D-backs DFA'd Vieira over Miguel Castro. I know Vieira came into the same type of situations as Castro, low leverage situations, but I thought Vieira was actually decent. He threw super hard. I was like, there's something there with Vieira if the D-backs can actually turn him into a weapon. Miguel Castro just cooked as a reliever, and that's why I think the D-backs need to go out there and sniff around the reliever market. So let's talk about some dream versus realistic trade candidates as the deadline is only a few hours away. I think the guy that teams are checking in the most when it comes to relievers is a little Mason Miller from the Oakland A's, who is, I think, potentially hurt right now. Regardless, he's having a fantastic season. A guy who is still only 25 years old. He is cost controlled through 2030, so you would have him for a very long time. He's a major strikeout artist, which I think is what appeals to the opposing teams. 15 and a half strikeouts per nine, a sub .83, or I won't say sub. His whip is just .836, like absolutely insane. This guy gives up no hits, no home runs. Does he give up a few walks from time to time? Yes. That's probably the biggest hole and flaw in his game is the walk rate. He probably gives up maybe just a tad few many of those, but when you're arguably the best strikeout monster as a reliever, when you don't give up a lot of earned runs, when you don't give up a lot of hits, I think you're fine. Averages 100 miles per hour on the heater. Like Mason Miller is absolutely nasty, and if the D-backs could get him, that would be a major addition to this bullpen. And with a guy like Paul Sewald, a little shaky, Mason Miller would immediately step up and be the closer for the D-backs. And then you can use Paul Sewald as a high leverage back end reliever. And hopefully that works out for him. Hopefully he doesn't mind being in that role. But Mason Miller is just too nasty to make him the setup man. He would have to be the closer with a Paul Sewald potentially as the setup guy. I would love to get Mason Miller. And plus the fact that he's only 25 years old. Again, we love guys who are long-term pieces. That's why I'm in on the Crochets and the Screwballs, because those guys could be in the organization for a few years and not just 1-year rentals. Will Mason Miller be expensive? Yes. Anyone who's 25, cost controlled, and throws 100 is going to be expensive as a reliever, but he's still someone that I would think about pulling the trigger against. I think another great dream guy is a Peter Fairbanks from the Tampa Bay Rays. Another guy, just you look at the K numbers, really, really strong numbers for Fairbanks. I don't know why I'm struggling to say his name. I think it's because my allergies are acting up and I'm starting to get very nasally over here. But Pete, I'm just going to call him that. Having a good season, not an elite season like we've seen the last couple of years. 3.11 ERA. The strikeout numbers really aren't there like they were in the past. For his career, 12 strikeouts per nine. Over the last 4 years, he's at 13 strikeouts per nine. But for some reason this season, he's sub 9 Ks per 9 innings. Now he's still a guy, pretty good whip, 1.195. Hits per nine, 6.9. He's fine there, doesn't give up home runs, but is not striking out the same rate, and he's walking still people at a pretty decent clip at the same time. Pete Fairbanks, I definitely think, is a tier below Mason Miller, but I also think is a guy that could still be a little bit of a little expensive, because I think a lot of teams are going to look at Mason Miller's price tag and do the drop down method and say, you know what, I could get 85-90% of the production of Miller with a Fairbanks, who also averages around 97 miles per hour on his fastball, also a strikeout machine. I feel like you could think Pete Fairbanks is a close enough facsimile of Mason Miller and be okay doing a little drop down method and saying, you know what, maybe Mason Miller is a little bit too expensive, but I can afford a Fairbanks. But for the D-backs, I don't think, I think whatever reliever you try and target this trade deadline is probably going to be expensive, because that's just how it is once you get to the deadline. All these contenders need relievers for the back end of the bullpen. So would not be surprised if the price tag is a little bit more than expected for Fairbanks, but I still think it should be less than a Mason Miller. Now, if you're talking about realistic last-minute trade candidates for the bullpen, how about a former friend of the D-backs, a guy that is very, very familiar with the D-backs organization? How about a little Andrew Chafin? What if the D-backs went out there and brought back a little sheriff to Arizona? His most recent stop in AZ wasn't the best. He was here in 2023, 4.19 ERA, and was very shaky for some reason in 2023. After coming off a fantastic season with Detroit in 2022 with a 2.83 ERA, he's back with Detroit this season and once again pitching well. Maybe he has to be in Detroit to pitch well, but He has not been good for the D-backs. He was not good for the D-backs last year, but for some reason, when he's pitched for Detroit in 2022 and 2023, he's been a very effective pitcher. And once again, double-digit strikeouts per nine this season, 3.16 ERA. Like, Chafin is having a good year, and for a guy that's been familiar in the D-backs organization before, I would not be at all upset if the D-backs want to bring him back. The other realistic option, I think, is a guy that we actually saw last night, a guy that the D-backs lit up in the ninth inning. Kyle Finnegan, I actually would be interested in bringing in. And I actually think his price tag could be potentially a little low after what the D-backs did to him last night. I don't think he's the most elite reliever in the world, but I do think he's good. Even after last night's debacle, a 3.48 ERA, he has the most games finished in the National League, is a 1.091 whip, 9 strikeouts per 9 innings. Like, he's just a good guy. Solid strikeout numbers, solid walk rate, solid whip. Like, he's just solid all around. I think Andrew Chafin and Kyle Finnegan are both solid. I think Pete and Mason Miller are both elite, are both great to elite pitchers for the back end of your bullpen. So for the D-backs, if you just don't want to get good, solid options, go for a Chafin or a Finnegan. But if you really want to swing for the fence for a guy that could replace a Paul Sewald, go for a Mason Miller or go for a Pete Fairbanks. Now, I got a couple of last-minute bats that the D-backs should consider trading for at this year's deadline, and we'll break it down in segment number 2. But hey, if you're looking for supplies, then I suggest Supply House, because get supplies from the site that's made for the skilled trades, supplyhouse.com. Supplyhouse.com is a reliable way to order plumbing, HVAC, and electrical products online. Their easy-to-use website is packed with helpful resources and the latest product info to help you get the job done right. Shop a complete inventory of over 200,000 parts from over 400 top brands and get your order delivered right to your door with fast shipping from coast to coast. Need help with an order? Get expert support and industry-leading service from the friendliest folks in the business, and talk to a real person every time. Pros in the skilled trades can get a competitive edge by joining supplyhouses.com's free Trade Master program. Every Trade Master gets access to a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. Join the thousands of trade pros already benefiting from their free memberships at supplyhouse.com/TM and order plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies from anywhere with just a few clicks at supplyhouse.com. All right. Let's get back to the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast, and let's discuss some last-minute options. Now for the lineup, let's discuss some bats for the D-backs, because for the D-backs, I think you're either looking at a power righty, a power lefty for the outfield, if you think you can get someone that's a better power guy than the combination of the McCarthy, the Grichuk, and the Thomas. You're trying to look for the DH outfielder that could be an upgrade over that trio, either from the left or right side. Or I think you're looking for maybe a potential offensive upgrade in the infield, like that Kevin Newman spot. Maybe you're looking to upgrade that. Maybe someone to platoon with the Geraldo Perdomo. Domo's your lefty. Shortstop, maybe you look for a lefty righty for the left side of your infield to platoon with the Perdomo if you want to upgrade the Kevin Newman spot. That's what I think you're looking for. If you're the D-backs this deadline, you're probably looking for a power bat. And it's either a lefty power bat to upgrade the combo of McCarthy or Thomas. I think it'd be a little bit tougher to upgrade the Grichuk spot, but maybe you want to upgrade that Kevin Newman spot, a guy to platoon with Geraldo Perdomo at shortstop this season. Now, if you're talking about dream scenarios, I think number 1, Luis Robert from the Chicago White Sox. This is a potential superstar currently in a terrible situation. I want to save all the Chicago White Sox and none other than a Luis Robert. Or maybe a Garrett Crochet is probably the only other guy I would want more than Luis Robert. But I think this guy's a stud. I think he's a true monster. The issue is he's always hurt. Only 54 games this year. Only has one season under his belt with over 100 games played. That was in 2023. But you can see the numbers. When he does play and when he is healthy, he's a stud. 38 bombs last year in 145 games. 20 stolen bases. At 857 OPS. Like, he was a beast last season. And for the D-backs, pairing him with a Corbin Carroll as your long-term outfielders, 2 guys who are having down seasons, but their ceiling could be MVP type guys, like, yeah, I would love to pair him with a Corbin Carroll. On the second to last year of his contract, I think is very interesting. Still super young, only 26 years of age, pairs with Corbin Carroll perfectly. Those two could be two long-term building blocks for the D-backs, and I think you could really build around that. I think really build around that duo as an outfield. Now, do I think he'd be super expensive? Yes, I do, because he is in his prime. He is a guy that has monster power ability. So I do think he would cost a pretty hefty price tag. Maybe you even have to give up like a guy like Drew Jones or Jordan Lawler. Like, I don't know. I do think that's possible. But the other reason why he's enticing to get this season is because maybe that price tag won't be as bad knowing his numbers are really down. He's having his worst season of his career, a 221 average, a 741 OPS. Like, he's not having the same type of season that he had last year. So maybe because of that, being in a terrible situation, needs a change of scenery. Maybe he's a little bit cheaper than the typical guy of the stature and elk, but I still think he would cost a lot. And if you want to think about trading for a guy to pair with Jock Peterson as your righty DH, because if you're trading for Luis Robert, then you think he's clearly better than Randall Grichuk. I still think you'll probably keep Randall Grichuk in the mix, but I don't know. What do you do with your McCarthy, Thomas, and Grichuk outfield? Maybe a couple of these guys get packaged in the Luis Robert deal, and it makes it easier to make your outfield decisions. But Luis Robert is coming in to disrupt the outfield if you acquire him. But if you get a Brent Rooker who's having himself a fantastic season, he makes it a little bit of an easier decision of where to play, because he would automatically just be DH. Lefty on the mound, Brent Rooker is DHing. Righty on the mound, Jock Peterson is DHing. And those two guys as your DH would be absolutely fantastic. And then you can still do Randall Grichuk as your platoon guy when there's a lefty on the mound too, so he doesn't have to leave. Then at that point, you probably would have to make a decision between Alek Thomas or Jake McCarthy, or even potentially a Kevin Newman, but I don't think you would get rid of one of your backup infielders. I think you would probably get rid of your outfielders at that point if you went out there and acquired a Brent Rooker, who is having himself once again a fantastic season. And maybe because his season is so well that he would be a little bit expensive. It sounds like the Oakland A's love Brent Rooker. It sounds like they want to keep him around. And for a guy who has 25 home runs, 75 ribbies in 93 games, I can see why the A's would want to keep him. A 957 OPS, like he's having a monster year. But still, he's only a guy that pretty much DHs primarily. So I don't think the price tag could be insane for him. He is a guy that's cost controlled through 2028, so that will raise the price tag a little bit. But if you could get a Jock Peterson, Brent Rooker DH combination, like, I think Grichuk Jock combination has already arguably been the best DH in the National League, at least top three. Brent Rooker and Jock Peterson would actually be the best DH combination in the National League. And then you could say the D-backs probably would have the best platoon situation, because if you're throwing out guys like Jock Peterson when there's a righty on the mound with the potential Jake McCarthy's and the Carrolls and all the other lefties the D-backs have, the Domos. And then when there's a righty on the mound, you're throwing in the Brent Rookers and the Grichuks, and like the Morenos are batting second. Like, the D-backs would probably have the best platoon lineup in the league at that point. And we know that's something that Torey Lovullo loves. So I would love to bring a Brent Rooker into the mix. But if we're trying to be realistic, because of the two dream scenario guys, if we're being realistic, how about Luis I have trouble pronouncing his name. Rengifo, Luis Rengifo, I believe that's how you pronounce it, from the Los Angeles Angels. He's having himself a very strong season. Does he have the power of maybe what the D-backs are searching for? Maybe not. 421 slugging this year, but overall, really good season. 300 average, 23 stolen bases in 75 games. And if you're thinking about Luis, I think you're upgrading Kevin Newman's spot, because he's a guy that plays all over the infield, second, third, and shortstop. He's got a ton of speed. He's having a great season offensively. I think you would platoon this guy with Geraldo Perdomo as a guy that's also a switch hitter in Luis. I think you would pair him with Geraldo Perdomo. And Luis is the guy that hits better against left-handed pitching. He's batting .373 against lefties, 948 OPS against lefties. We know Domo is going to be better against righties, so that could be the perfect platoon situation with Geraldo Perdomo. add a guy with defensive versatility, a high contact ability this season, and a lot of speed, I think that would be great for the D-backs. Or if you're looking for another power outfielder that could platoon a little bit, maybe he DHs with the Jock Petersons, or maybe he plays a little D-backs outfield, even though I would have to check the defensive metrics on him. I don't know if he'd be better than any of the D-backs current outfielders, so he might only be a DH primarily. But I didn't think a Mike Yastrzemski was a bad idea. If you're doing this, you're probably getting rid of one of your lefty outfielders, either in the Alek Thomas or Jake McCarthy, because him playing DH probably doesn't make a ton of sense for you. With Jock Peterson already being your lefty DH, you're not also going to DH Mike Yastrzemski when there's a lefty on the mound. I don't think that would be the best use of Mike Yastrzemski. But if you wanted to say, you know what, Alek Thomas, we love your defense, but offensively you're not doing enough. When there's a righty on the mound, we're going Mike Yastrzemski now in the outfield. Maybe we go Corbin Carroll, Jake McCarthy, and Yaz in the outfield, and we see Gurriel a little bit more when there's a righty on the mound. I don't know, but if the D-backs want to add another lefty power bat into the mix because you're not getting enough from Carroll, Thomas, and McCarthy from the power situation from the left side, Yastrzemski is someone that has a ton of power. He only has 8 home runs this season, but 8 triples as well, which leads the National League, 9 doubles, and a 440 slugging, which would be one of the leaders on this National League team. So Yastrzemski is an interesting option. Now, I think the fact that he plays for the Giants, an NL West opponent, makes it a very difficult trade candidate, but we've seen the Giants already trade Jorge Soler. They might be sellers this deadline. They also have a couple of other outfielders that would be interesting platoon depth pieces like in a Conforto. So just something for the D-backs to think about. Yaz, if you want to really get a power lefty, because the power lefties in your outfield haven't done it for you this season, I think Yaz could be a very interesting option. That's it for this edition of the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast. Come back tomorrow for more Diamondbacks news coverage and insight, as we'll talk about the MLB trade deadline. And as always, stay safe, stay healthy. Deuces.